Hi, this is Aaron for BlueFirePoker.com, and I have part two of my ICM series. And we're starting off here with bubble play. I think this is probably the the part of this series where people are making it's the part of tournaments where people are making the biggest mistakes, and it's the part of this series where I think I can explain exactly what that mistake is and how to exploit it. So I wanted to start off with a note on exploitive play. Uh, if you're watching this in the archive in 2014, this video might not even be very useful to you. Right now I'm focusing on strategies to exploit a common leak in 2012 in tournaments. And that leak is that most players are too willing to risk going out right before the money. And it hasn't really always been the case that most players made this mistake. There was even a time when players were generally too conservative and too tight in tournaments, especially on the money bubble. But at this point, the state of the games is very aggressive. And there's a couple different things that have contributed to this. I didn't list it here, but just comparing to earlier eras, partly players have just learned. It's taken almost a decade, but players have just learned how to play loosely and aggressively with a short stack correctly. Finally, but of course, on the money bubble of a tournament, all that to some extent goes out the window, and there's a whole new set of rules and. ICM correct play can often be counterintuitive. There are a lot of situations where you're ahead of your opponent's range, or you're actually making profiting chips on average when you make a play, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a correct play. And results can be particularly misleading. A lot of people can get by with a results-oriented approach to just play a lot of poker and see what works, and a lot of people can take a results-oriented approach to learning a lot of situations. If you're playing 100 big blinds deep, no ante, and under the gun opens, and you 3-bet ace queen offsuit under the gun +1, and your default strategy is to 5-bet shove over a 4-bet with ace queen there. Well, your results will pretty quickly tell you that you're just never getting your chips in ahead. You're getting them in flipping or usually behind. And so you learn and stop doing that. But the problem with a lot of ICM is you'll frequently see that you're getting your chips in okay, and it can take a long time to realize that you just aren't cashing as many tournaments as you should be because you're playing too many hands. And the other reasons are maybe a little bit less academic reasons and more psychological reasons. There's this sort of common leak, partly because people play tournaments to win. It's more fun. It's more exciting. It's something you can brag about. And ICM correct play just doesn't optimize your chance of winning a tournament. If you wanted to maximize your chances of winning a tournament, then you would want to maximize how many chips you win in every single hand, and you wouldn't care at all whether you finished in 7th place or 700th place. Money bubble, things like that just is not even a consideration. So clearly, this isn't. Well, I guess I shouldn't say clearly, but I would recommend that you do not purely try as hard as you can to win the tournament. And I think when I get through this series, and hopefully maybe even the first part of it has already convinced you that that's not what you want to be doing. Another contributing factor is just the fact that a large percentage of professional tournament players are backed because of the variance in tournaments. And most backing plans have what's called makeup, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's where the player and the backer split profits whenever a player reaches a total profit even including the earlier buy-ins that he paid. So so the previous buy-ins are called makeup, and a player needs to cash for more than all of his previous losses in order to actually split the profit and see any immediate money back. And because immediate money back is a powerful motivating force for players, a lot of players are not very interested in getting that small payout you get for cashing. They're interested in getting a large cash, like first or second or something that might clear their makeup and get them a split with their backer. And this might not really seem like a big deal to you, but if you look at a lot of poker forums and talk to a lot of these guys that are running these tournaments, you'll find out that almost all of them are backed. So even if most make a good faith effort to help their backer, and just play their best, it's psychologically it's very hard to avoid just playing, especially when players get in tons and tons of makeup. So I mean, I'm not trying to say that everyone's a scumbag, but just to be realistic here, you have a lot of players that are just playing very aggressively with other people's money, and that's just not going to lead to situations where everyone is really looking out for that little bit of value you can get on the bubble by making sure you cash. So I've got this broken down into short stack, big stack, and average stack play, because you kind of have a different specific strategy and game plan with each stack size. So I'll start out here with short stack bubble play. The first most important thing that I consider is my stack value versus the minimum payout when I'm making decisions. When you have a short stack, a lot of your value is going to come from making the minimum payout, of course. And to make this comparison, you're going to have run into a lot of problems because, as we saw in part one, determining the value of your stack is often difficult. You might know, pretty well what the payouts are. I mean, you can just look this up. But knowing what to compare it to, like what else are you risking with your stack besides not getting the minimum payout, and what else can you win if you increase your stack, is very difficult to calculate. But one rough estimate of value that I like to use is I do a comparison to starting stack, and I do a comparison to the entrance fee. So for example, I might consider a player with 3 times the starting chips, and he's on a bubble that pays 2 times the buy-in is the minimum payout. This is a situation where you should be very focused on reaching the money. The reason for this is that your chip stack really isn't even worth that much. You haven't increased your stack very much. On the money bubble, the average stack is going to be far greater. And so you aren't really in a great position to win the tournament. Even if you double up, like 6 times the starting stack still isn't even a lot of chips, but you are often in a great position to tighten up a little bit and let the other players in the tournament make the mistake of gambling with each other in marginal spots, and you can just move up and get into the payouts. So when we're considering these rough estimates, and we're just making approximations and adjustments, one really useful guideline is that the smaller your chip stack, the tighter you should play. And this is an example of something that's very counterintuitive about ICM play, because it's the opposite of non-bubble play. In general, if you're short stacked, your range just gets wider as you get shorter. Like on the button, you can go all in with a worse hand if you have 8 big blinds than if you have 18 big blinds. But on the bubble, there are actually going to be spots where once you get so short that you only have 8 big blinds or whatever, really all you can do is just try to fold into the money. Whereas when you have more chips, there's more value in doubling up and really being able to play. And kind of to say this a little more precisely, your stack decreases the reason for this is that as your stack decreases more and more, of the equity in your stack comes from reaching the lowest payout, and less of it comes from the times you finish at the top. And I wrote this like symbolically or mathematically, but this is not like a calculation that you should do. I just wanted to explain for people that are maybe a little more like literal or visual or mathematical. So consider like your total equity in a tournament is E, and so we can write that your total equity is like expected value, right? So you do each possible outcome to find the expected value of something. You do each possible outcome times each possible frequency of that outcome, and you just add them up, and that's what expected value is. So here I've got P's are not probability here. It's a little confusing, sorry, but P is the prize for whatever place. Excuse me, for first, second, and it can be a prize awarded to more than one place. For example, in a tournament, 28th through 36th might all get the same amount. And F is how likely you are to get that place. You might have like a 1% chance of getting first place for $900 or whatever. You know, you might have a 12% chance of getting 28th through 36th for $109, or, you know, there's so, but your total equity is going to be your chance of getting each different amount times what that amount is, and that's going to be your total equity. So you can imagine that as your stack gets shorter, your chance of getting whatever, like say 38 or 28 through 36 is the lowest payout. Well, as your stack gets lower, your chances of getting that are going to decrease, of course. You're going to be likely to bust right away and get nothing. But what's going to decrease even more quickly is going to be your chance of winning. That should be pretty obvious. When you're short stacked, you know, you have a long way to go to accumulate all the chips in the entire tournament, but you don't necessarily have a long way to go to cash. All you need is for other people to bust. So as your stack gets shorter, and, you know, for example, what I said before, going from 18 versus 8 BBs, the frequency of getting high payouts is going to decline faster than low payouts. When you go from 18 to 8, your frequency of first place has decreased by over 50%. But your chance of making the money might not have decreased by that much at all. There might be 37 players left, and it might not even be that difficult to cash at all. So that's why this like end part, the frequency end of the payout end, like the frequency of getting the lowest payout, that term is going to become a big part of your equity as your stack gets lower. So that's of course the extreme examples can be very extreme. You know, there are times when you're maybe, say, even in the big blind with only a couple blinds behind, and you see that you're on the exact bubble as hand for hand, and another stack goes out of the tournament. Well, at this point, even though you might be getting 2-1 or 3-1 or something absolutely ridiculous on your money, if your stack is short enough and the value of your stack once you cash is going to be low enough, even if you double up, then you can get to spots where you end up folding away a huge percentage of your stack in the blinds and really kind of crushing your chances to win the tournament just to make the money, because you're guaranteed to make the money. You know, in my example, another player just went out and it's hand for hand. You're guaranteed to make the money, and your stack is just not even worth that much aside from its final part, its chance of making the money. And there's one more adjustment that might not be popular with some of you, but it's quite a bit easier to understand, and it's something that I do all the time, and I do actually recommend it quite a bit, and that's stalling. The way online tournaments are set up, you have a time bank, and players are allowed to use it however they want. And I recommend that if it's getting near the money in a tournament and you're short stacked, then I recommend that you take the maximum amount of time each hand to fold, and that you also maybe look for spots to run down your time bank a little bit. and I do recommend saving a little bit in case you have to make a tough decision, but run down your time bank a little bit and slow down the action. The reason for this is pretty obvious. If you're short stacked, then each hand you're at risk of busting. So you want to minimize the hands you play, and that way you're minimizing your shots at going out of the tournament. Other adjustments that I talked about, essentially what they all come down to is they're hands that you normally would play, and they have some small amount of chips that on average you'd accumulate. They have some small plus chip expected value. And it's small enough that you don't want to risk losing chips the times that you don't win the hand, and so you fold them. This adjustment doesn't require you to fold hands that are plus EV in chips, though you might be stalling and playing tight at the same time, but you don't necessarily have to do both. What it does cost you is your win rate over the extra hands that you would have played. You're playing fewer hands, and win rates in poker are basically measured in big blinds per 100 hands. And what that means is just that. I mean, over a certain number of hands, you're winning a certain amount of chips, and if you play fewer hands, you do lose that win rate. However, compared to the up and down swings of a hand of poker, where you might very easily lose 10 or 20 or 100 big blinds, your win rate in hands is going to be very low. A good win rate, per 100 hands might be 4 or 5 big blinds, and so of course per hand we're talking about a 20th of a big blind or something. So if you miss a hand, it's actually not costing you. You're not passing up on as much as when you fold a plus EV shove. And when we say that a good win rate is 4 or 5 big blinds, we're not talking about a situation where you're short stacked on the bubble. I mean, a situation where you're short stacked on the bubble, you might not even have a positive win rate on the table. You might be passing on so many plus EV hands, and you're not in there mixing it up with like loose hands, like punishing the bad players, whatever. You might not even have a positive win rate. You might, for that temporary little bit of the tournament when you're trying to make the money, you might not really be accumulating any chips to your stack on average. And so, of course, in that case, you benefit doubly from not playing hands, because you're not bleeding as many chips to the more aggressive players, and you're not having the risk of busting. So I do recommend that you stall, and I also recommend that poker sites change the rules of tournaments or the implementation of the time bank or whatever, and prevent this, because obviously if everyone starts doing it, it might lead to a lot of problems or make tournaments like unfun for fish to play or whatever. But in the meantime, it's just a ton of value, and some people are doing it, and there's no reason that someone else should have an edge on you. This isn't like a situation like sitting out against fish in cash games or anything like that, because it's a small, like, stalling is going to be a small change to the game, and it's perfectly within the rules and doesn't hurt anyone, except for once everyone starts doing it and tournaments become less fun. I will probably be discussing stalling with some of you on the forums, but I want to get through the rest of this video, so I'll leave it for that. So I wanted to move on from short stack bubble play and talk about big stack bubble play. The first thing with playing a big stack bubble or anywhere, but especially on the bubble, is you have to be aware that you're going to have a lot more massively plus EV situations. You're going to have a lot more really good spots in tournaments when you have a big stack, and that's part of why loose aggressive style is so effective in tournaments in general, even though specifically on the bubble, you generally want to play it tight, or at least unless you already have a big stack. But basically, your expected value is going to be, in a lot of hands, is going to be like your edge times your volume. And so A short stack is going to need really high expected value hands to play on the bubble. He's not going to look for spots where he expects to, on average, increase his stack by 10% or whatever, but has a very high chance of going out, like a risky re-steal type play or whatever, because the dollar value of the chips that he adds on is low. But a larger stack can quickly have the dollar value of the chips he adds on be high, even if it's not a big edge. My example here for just like I didn't even include any blinds, any antes, just somehow gambling like on a 60-40, like a situation where you have a 60% chance of winning, like ace king versus jack 10 suited or whatever. That's almost more like 50-50, but ace 10 versus ace king versus a slightly worse suited connector or whatever. But basically, you can see from this example that when you have 10 big blinds, you can win 2 big blinds from like a situation where you're playing a pot. When you have 100, you can win 20 big blinds, and both the 100 big blind stack and the 10 big blind stack see the same benefit from folding their way into the money. So you're comparing the same risk with in this case, a reward that's 10 times greater. So basically, the edge that you have to play just goes way down, and you can really open up a lot with a big stack. And of course, one of the ways you can open up is by trying to steal the blinds a lot. That's a situation where it's, of course, high risk because you're a big stack and you're aggressive, and even if people are playing tight, at a 9-handed table, someone's going to wake up with a good hand a decent percentage of the time and shove on you, and you'll have to fold, or you might get someone might trap you somehow or whatever. So there's some risk involved, and as we saw on the previous slide, we're willing to take some risks with our bigger stack. The question is, should we? Now, if you recall at the beginning, I talked about how our ICM strategy is going to be geared around exploiting people, because this is an area where the way people are playing in tournaments is very far away from an optimal way of playing in tournaments. Optimal play would have the biggest stacks winning a lot of hands without showdown, just stealing the blinds, and the short stacks playing tight and just trying to outlast each other into the money on the bubble of a tournament. When instead you have players who are short stacked and find spots that are marginal to play back at the bigger stacks, what you have is a situation where those players are hurting themselves and they're giving up EV, but they aren't helping the big stack. They're also hurting the big stack that's stealing their blind by forcing that player to either tighten up or by winning a few chips off that player. Who they're really helping with their exploitable play is the other short stacks. They're helping the other short stacks by some of the time busting on their plus EV, on their aggressive plays, and allowing those short stacks to cash more often than they should. So you can't, as a big stack, it's actually maybe a little bit less profitable now than it should be according to like a game theoretical tournament playing out. So you can't benefit from the players who are supposedly making a mistake. It's I mean, not supposedly, they are making a mistake, but a game theoretical mistake, as opposed to like the individual hands they're playing, do win them chips. They just aren't worth the risk for the most part. I mean, some players do spew, but what I'm talking about is exploitive play, and you don't really have an exploitive play against those players. You just have to be aware of it and not raise them. You can raise them more than you would not on the bubble, but not just go crazy on their blind. So what you actually want to look for is opponents who aren't playing badly. You want to look for opponents, and when I say badly, I mean deviating from an ICM strategy. I don't mean that these players are like fish or something, but in fact, they're playing well against you. They're just playing badly against the opponents that they forget they even have, which is the guy on the other table who has 7 big blinds and is delighted when he somehow makes the money because a bunch of other guys got all in. So basically, you want to pick opponents to bluff who aren't playing more loose than optimally. You want to pick the guys who are playing like a correct ICM strategy, which basically is going to be, to some extent, the people who watched the earlier slides and are making correct adjustments. But those are going to be the people that you end up winning money from, because their correct adjustments are costing the other short stacks money, not costing you money. Their adjustments are giving you money. And of course, there are going to be people who aren't really thinking about adjusting or anything like that. There are people who are just really tight and in this case have kind of stumbled on the correct strategy by trying to make the money, but in fact they might even overcompensate and play too tight. So a really great indicator of this is a low average buy-in. Most poker players, of course, like to gamble, and if they have money, they do gamble, and they play tournaments of like a higher buy-in or whatever. So a player who plays low buy-in tournaments, usually, I mean, sometimes it's a professional player who feels he's a big winner at the lower stakes and just grinds a lot of tables or whatever. But usually it's a player who has won less money or has less money or whatever. And of course, a person who has less money is going to want to move up. Just so you know, when I say like average buy-in, I'm talking about like a statistic that you would get. There are several different ranking and tracking sites that include a player's average buy-in. There's also sites like the 2+2 forums or the Pocket Fives forums, where players might have a profile or like a list of tournaments they've played, things like that. That will give you some indication of whether the player plays high or low buy-ins or not. You can find out a lot of this stuff just by Googling your opponent's screen name. You're probably not going to be able to get it from your own hands with a player, your own like Hold'em Manager, Poker Tracker, or whatever, because it's going to reflect your average buy-in. It's going to be the tournaments that you both played. Of course, because we're looking for people that are playing short stacks, that are playing a correct ICM strategy to be the people that we raise against. Stalling is one of the things I listed, and a player who's stalling is probably a player who is going to be making correct adjustments for ICM, and which will mean adjustments that allow you to steal his blind more often. But it can be surprisingly hard to perceive players who are stalling, partly because a lot of people, if they have one table left or whatever, they start talking to their friends on Instant Messenger, they start watching movies on Netflix, start drinking, whatever. So they might start playing slowly, but if anything, they're not stalling, they're distracted, and they're going to be more likely to either not even know it's the bubble, or more likely to have one table left and just want to bust out of it. So if you can perceive that a player is intentionally taking the longest amount of time that he can on each hand, then he's usually going to be a good spot to steal from. But a player who just acts slowly is not necessarily something you can be really confident about. When you look at players with like a low, I'm not sure why this is PVIP, just a typo. What we're talking about is players with a low VIP, what I want is VPIP, voluntarily put money in pot. This is a statistic on Hold'em Manager and Poker Tracker. But basically what I mean is people that you can see are playing tight. And of course, people that you see are playing tight aren't necessarily even playing tight, because most people can't really remember over 4 orbits, 5 orbits, how many times a guy's opened with a great degree of accuracy. So I would recommend that you use tracking software to be aware of that. But basically, it's of limited usefulness anyway, because your sample size is going to be it's not going to be that big, especially if players play differently on the bubble versus not on the bubble, and because a lot of players have a tight style normally because they think that's how to win money in tournaments. They think they'll just wait for good hands and wait for spots that they like, and they only like to play certain spots and whatever, and so they're tight. But when you start raising their blind a lot, they think the correct way to play in tournaments is to play tight, and when they see you playing really loose and raising their blind a lot, they're not even thinking about ICM or the bubble or anything like that. And so a lot of these tight players will actually start to fight back at you quite a bit and re-steal you pretty late. So although tight play is generally something you want out of your opponents, and it's a good time to steal their blind, I would warn you to, if you know a guy has a $11 average buy-in and he's on the bubble of a 1K, or if you know a guy is deliberately running his time bank down, well, that's a guy you can just raise his blind with any 2 cards. But if a guy has just been kind of tight for the last half hour, that's not necessarily a guy you can raise with any 2 cards. Where VPIP is useful is when you want to do what I think a big stack is best for on the bubble, which is to aggressively battle other players who are opening up. They're going to be both big and medium, and probably even some small stacks who are trying to bully the bubble, and they're playing a lot of hands, and a lot of times they're playing a lot more hands than they're used to playing. In general, it's not part of their regular game plan to open, ace 2 suited under the gun or whatever, and so they don't have it in their range to 4-bet that hand when they get 3-bet, or to 3-barrel that hand when they get flatted because people are calling them really light or whatever. So those are the guys that you want to open up against when you have a big stack, and you want to punish them for playing more hands than they usually play, and look for spots to rebluff them, look for spots to catch them bluffing you, just stuff like that. So, and of course, like I said, that is an area where your heads-up display and the player's VPIP is going to be pretty useful. So the last part of this video is average stack bubble play, and what we have here is the way average stack should be playing on the bubble in if everyone was playing like optimally or playing using ICM, would be pretty like tight aggressive, like basically players like looking for spots to like pressure each other and not looking for spots to make big calls, stuff like that. But that's kind of irrelevant, because what we actually have is players just playing way too loose and not tightening up at all for the bubble. And so what I recommend when you have an average stack on the bubble is actually very similar to short stack play. I would primarily, what I do when I'm short stacked is I primarily focus on exploiting the reckless players. This is where you can get some, in my opinion, some really good spots leading up to and on the bubble of a tournament. You can get spots where you have an average stack, and other players in the tournament with an average stack are just absolutely going to war with each other. If it's a high anti-structure and an aggressive high stakes tournament or whatever, and they're really playing a lot of big pots with each other, and players are busting really quickly. And of course, the way to exploit this on the bubble in terms of ICM is to play even tighter, because I talked about this a little bit in the first part of the series. When people are just going out really fast, playing tight shows you more immediate benefits. You just immediately start moving up the payouts or moving up towards the bubble, and you're just way more likely to cash. I think stalling is still a viable tactic even with an average stack. Again, because the other average stacks are just busting so much that you're willing to play fewer hands, even if you do have like a positive win rate at the table. You're willing to play fewer hands because, unlike with a small stack, you can play fewer hands, you can play tighter, but eventually the blinds will get you, and you probably are going to have to, depending on how far out from the bubble you are, you do have to gamble sometimes. With an average stack, you will get spots, more spots than a short stack where you want to gamble. Like I said earlier on, the smaller your stack gets, the tighter you get, and vice versa. But what you won't get is spots where the blinds just absolutely force you to gamble, especially now because structures are so good. So there are just a lot of spots where you can maybe have like 63 players cash, and there's 90 or 100 players left or something, and you have an average stack, and you can actually be almost 100% certain that you're going to cash, just by stalling and like tightening up a little bit, doing some of these other things that I talk about. And to me, that's just like a huge boost to your ROI if you just start cashing for double the buy-in, which a lot of tournaments pay out now. You just start cashing for double the buy-in, very, very high frequency. So that being said, in addition to some of the aspects of a short stack, when you have an average stack on the bubble, you also have aspects of a big stack, because there are going to be probably half the players almost are going to be people that you cover and people that are much more at risk than you. And you can put pressure on them, but you have to pick targets even more carefully. The reason for this is because if someone knows that you're concerned, or even just assumes this because for whatever reason, if someone thinks that you're concerned about caching, but that you're opening up to steal from the blind of a player who's even more concerned about caching, like a real short stack guy, this is just a really ideal spot for someone to start 3-betting you and really put a lot of pressure on you, because you have a big range to open certain hands, like when a certain player is in the big blind or whatever, but your range to play back is going to be even tighter because it's the bubble and you're an average stack. So you just have to be really careful and be alert for that. And there's some things you can do to minimize your risk of busting, which is to consider different preflop lines, such as flat calling and overbet shoving, as opposed to a lot of players get in situations where they 3-bet and call a shove, or 3-bet and 5-bet a 4-bet, or whatever, with like some kind of marginal hands, which is the inevitable product of playing tournaments with good aggressive players and a big ante. But you can avoid it if you think someone has a reasonably tight range and raises. You can consider flat calling hands that are very like fit or fold on the flop that you might 3-bet. For example, if like an average to tight player raises your big blind in like middle or like even late, but maybe not button or whatever, like middle late position, you might just call with a hand like ace queen offsuit in the big blind, because especially if your stack size is like 20-25 big blinds or whatever, because if you make a pair, so other than like a king queen exported, if you make a pair, it's going to be top pair, top kicker, or second kicker, whatever. It's going to be like pretty much the nuts, and you're going to be able to most people continuation bet a lot, and you're going to be able to just check raise and get the money on the flop. And if you miss, you're going to be able to fold, and you avoid getting in spots where you're a coin flip pre-flop against like pocket nines or something. The other option that you have is like overbet shoving, and I don't mean like huge overbet shoving, though that is something to consider, especially in extreme situations like satellite bubbles. But what I'm talking about is just slight overbets in spots where you might just 3-bet instead. And the reason that I would choose this as opposed to flat call is against a looser player, or with a hand where you'll have more marginal decisions post flop. An example of this might be you have 27 big blinds and you're in the big blind, and someone raises in like late to middle position or whatever, and you have ace king. This is a hand that you're even you're pretty reasonably happy to get it in, and you can get it in pre-flop against like ace queen or something. But you don't really want to three bet and get shoved on by like pocket fives or even jack 10 suited if it's really close to the bubble. So you can just shove against someone and pick up the pot a lot and still do pretty well against his calling range, and you're not giving up as much as you would by flatting, but you're not getting the risks of three betting and like inducing a four bet that's like almost flipping against you. You're just kind of forcing those hands out. The reason that I want to overbet shove more often against a loose player and I want to call more often against a tight player is not that I'm more afraid of the tight player, like having a good hand or whatever, because in both these situations, like I'm playing, it's a hand that like the ace queen and the ace king example, it's a hand that you just aren't willing to fold pre-flop to anyone, and it's just a really good hand. The reason is you don't want to give the loose player with his like bad hands more of a free roll when you flat. Like if he has 5-6 suited or whatever, hands like that, like there's just a lot of hands that you would have just made straight up fold pre-flop, and now you're giving him a shot to bust you. Whereas the tight player has fewer hands that he's just going to straight up fold pre-flop to your shove. So you're better off just trying to avoid an all-in altogether by calling. I hope that made some sense. I'll try to get some example hands for you guys in a video soon. We're about at the end of the slides here, and this has probably been pretty dense, so I might not include any examples at the end of it, but I think I've talked about plenty of examples while I've just verbally while I've been going over these, and I hope everything I've said has been pretty clear. So I just want to talk a little bit about the future of bubble play, which is that despite the incentives that we talked about, such as like playing to win and excitement and backing incentives and whatever, the fact is the games are going to keep evolving, and ever since people started playing for a lot of money on the internet and getting good at poker, the evolution has really only gone one way, and that's towards optimal play. And so the only reasonable thing that we can expect is that the leaks that we're exploiting now by just playing really tight won't always be around, and pretty soon we're going to have to learn how to play against everyone else who plays the bubble a little more correctly and look for a little bit different strategies. One example of this was the Spring Championship of Online Poker recently. Some of the high buy-in events had a really, both in terms of the buy-in and in terms of absolute dollar value, had a very high payout for the minimum payout. Over 2,000 in 1K tournaments, for example. And I believe it was over 20,000 in the 10K, stuff like that. And what we saw during that series, if any of you railed any of these tournaments, was that players were beginning to make adjustments on the money bubble. There's a lot more stalling than I've ever seen before, and a lot more players who are pretty loose and aggressive were tightening up when they were shorter. And so I think this is a trend that's only going to continue. I bet most of you aren't even familiar with this, but about 5 years ago, sit and go tournaments were a lot more popular and a lot more fun for recreational players, and they were just a lot more beatable. People that didn't 40 table or that didn't know a ton of ICM or whatever were making money from them the same way people make money at tournaments, just by hand reading well and having good strategies. And basically what happened was it turned out that nothing else mattered, and skill at ICM essentially determined your win rate, and everyone who didn't know ICM that played sit and goes went broke really quickly. And I don't think tournaments will become quite like that, and I don't think it will happen anywhere near as quickly, but I do think that some of the the ICM adjustments from sit and goes will become more commonplace in tournaments, and a lot of the money that's out there now won't be around forever. So I do recommend that you go out and get it while you can. Thanks for watching.